So where does that leave our skills base as a country then? Because it seems to me what you're saying is that for large organisations that follow the sun, to use your expressions there, if we do similar work at a different time of day that in a large organisation around the world, then we need the same skills that we've got now, don't we? But in other organisations that outsource a lot of their fundamental skills, does that just leave us with more management type roles?
Well, I think that's part of it. I think there's a gap at the moment of people who know how to effectively run remote teams, and I just basically say that as a even team in Germany. You might have actually a team in Edinburgh. It's the same skill. Right. You're not sitting next to them, and
same principle applies. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it doesn't really matter where they sit. And the only problem then becomes time zones, and you just have to manage that. But to be honest, India can be four hours away at the right time of year. So it's not a huge, and depending where you are. So I've run in Germany, there were I think 3.5 at one point. It was very, very little in terms of time zone. The problem is of management and of the realization and education of our students and the people coming in of what sort of things they can expect when working with a remote team. And I don't think that, and I haven't seen it at least, is part of our education system at all at the moment.
Well, is there another more fundamental problem? I was looking a little bit at kind of like the history of computing over the last 40 years. And one of the key points, 1971 we saw the introduction of email. 1981 I think was the introduction of PCs. 91 was the introduction of the World Wide Web. So every 10 years, there's a major paradigm shift that nobody anticipated. Now, you look at the lead time behind training a primary school child up to getting them into a working situation. That's 10, 15 years' time. So we're trying to work out how to start educating them now to be ready for the workforce in 15 years, that we just don't know what that's going to look like. And maybe what we should be looking at more is less in terms of teaching them technology or computing or whatever, more about teaching them how to learn and teaching them how to critically evaluate things themselves.
I do think that's of critical importance because I've lived through that history. I started my career at ICL in 1968, so I saw all the things you've just listed happen and was part of it. And one of the benefits that I've had in my career is that I got a very, very solid training precisely toward the model you describe. So I've been able to adapt to each of those cycles as they come through and apply fundamental knowledge that I learnt quite early on. And I think this is one of the things that we've lost. We've got focused on technology and we've begun to lose sight of how to train people to be managers, systems analysts, and things of that kind, and the sort of roles that provide the framework in which technology is exploited. Mm-hmm. And I think there is a lot to be said for focusing some of the training on those basic things that don't actually change much over a period of 10 to 20 years, whereas the technology is changing quite fast underneath. So when I started, systems analysts could implement things either using computers or Kalamazoo forms. It didn't make any difference. It was just horses for courses. The skills to make that decision were what was important.
I think that's interesting. Is the move to improve the comprehension of computer science in schools actually going to help that?
Absolutely not. I'm absolutely convinced that it won't. It's going to be irrelevant, nearly. I think, because technology will move on. So the kids in school now, they may be 11, 12, 13, learning programming or programming techniques, will come to the end, will even come out of university, and that will have completely changed because we're talking about 10, 12 years, maybe even more. So
it's about the principles, though, rather than...
Well, I don't know. What are the principles? Critical thinking. Go on.
I think it is, actually. I think... that the move to actually emphasise computer science in schools means taking away school education from simply learning how to use Word and Excel and PowerPoint. This is actually taking us back to actually learning about the principles of whether you call it IT or computing, whatever you call it. So it is actually to give people a good education in the concepts and the principles so that they can apply that to all new technology as it evolves. And I think that is crucial. Certainly that would be my understanding of some of the recent debates and moves. And while I've got the floor, can I take exception? I think we're slightly in danger if we're not too careful of overemphasizing the need to teach people to manage contracts. I'm clear in my mind that we don't have enough people that are actually skilled at managing remotely, just as you're saying, Karim. But I think to carry on to say that's where all the focus should be and that's where we need to train, educate people, I think that there is a danger there, because I still think that we will need to develop the new industries that will come along that we haven't even thought about. We need people that understand the principles that underpin computing or IT, that can then apply them. Most recently, one might say in the games industry or the Internet of Things, but there will be a lot of other techniques. If we are only developing in this country managers who are good at contract management or letting contracts or managing remotely, I don't think that will serve us well in the long term.
No, and I started, I think, this debate by saying that we do need to the response of hollowing out, and I think that's a danger. And we do need the gamut of technical skills going forward. I don't think that will change. I think that the type of technical skill will change. Yeah. I think that, as we move forward, that, we no longer really program in assembly. Not many people anyway. I don't know anyone.
It's bound to change, isn't it?
It is. We're moving, higher and higher into more productive ways of actually creating products and systems, and I think that will change. However, there is right now this gap, right now, of people who are able to understand cultures, actually empathize. And I think it's really part of it. It's an empathy. It's actually understanding what's happening in the world. And going back to, I think you mentioned LinkedIn, where we've had several debates. I think people are at the risk of closing themselves off to what is an inevitability. We are not only going to have teams onshore. We are going to have distributed teams. That is for sure. So whether you like it or not, be prepared, because those skills and the skills that you need are going to change. You will need to be able to interface productively with someone who's sitting thousands of miles away. And if you don't, then you will not have a job.
I think there's a sense in which we approach some of these things with slightly the wrong mindset, and it's because we're English. And because English has become such a lingua franca, because of our history and the influence of the Americans, we have a slight tendency to go around the world speaking English and assume because we can communicate that everybody thinks and behaves the same, and it isn't true. So it's back to this cultural differences recognition, and I think if we're going to do the global thing, we have to start getting ourselves into the mindset where we expect to have to learn about different cultures that we now work with. I think the other side of the coin is that there's a tendency to think about the offshoring activity in some senses as a hierarchical thing. We offshore to you.
Yes.
Now, my view is that increasingly what we're looking at is the UK as part of a global network where we're not in any sense hierarchical, it's a network of peers. And I think there needs to be those two quite fundamental changes in mindset amongst a lot of people to make this work effectively.
That's a very much broader issue that I don't know that we can solve particularly, but it's an interesting point.
But it's crucial. I think it's fundamental to this debate. Offshoring, and you're absolutely right. You say, well, I had this experience in helping clients move offshore, and there was a Swedish group, very highly trained Swedish group of gaming professionals, and They were doing, you know, online gaming and all of that, and very, very good. And they stated, well, you know, one developer in Sweden is worth 3 in India or something. You know, we're 3 times better and more productive. And actually, that wasn't true. I mean, they had absolutely no basis for stating that. It was all sort of, well, you know, we're the master race nearly. You know, it sounds terrible, but when, you know, this is the attitude that we go over and needs to very quickly change.
It's interesting you say that, because there is a sort of role, I think, for BCS there. We're talking about the Sophia. One of the things I've got noted down here is a Sophia framework. And one of the questions we just had noted down here was that can we really compare the virtues of offshoring against onshoring unless we've got a framework to actually make comparisons between job roles? So, for example, that's purely a view of a few individual developers there in Sweden think they're better, and that's the end of it, isn't it?
Well,
but
I think Sweden, I took that as an example, but it's everywhere.
Of course, that attitude is everywhere. So what we're talking about here is a professional approach to HR and a rigorous approach to specifying skills when tendering takes place. Gary's shaking his head.
I think it's quite the opposite. I think in future contracts we'll go down an outcome-based approach, where does it matter what the skill set is of the developers or whatever, as long as the code is to produce to the specified requirements and quality. Do I need to know, what qualifications the developer has done in the past? And I know that I can see the squirming going on here, but ultimately, I quite often use the quick fit analogy. If I go down to the garage to have my exhaust replaced, I go to an exhaust specialist. They look at my car and they give me a price and a time. And it's the time at which I'll come back and it'll be ready. I don't go off and do an analysis of, well, are all your mechanics qualified to the requisite level? I don't ask them for a schedule of how they're doing everything. All I ask is that they deliver on time and on budget. And if there's any expectation that they come up with a problem, that they phone me well in advance. Now,
I take your point there, but going back to Karim's point, surely you don't think that there's a massive difference really in the skill sets, and nor do the people that fit the exhausts. But what we're saying is the attitude, perhaps in the Western world, is that we are better. So if we had a framework in place to say, actually, look, this is where I am in this framework, and actually these people here in India that are in exactly the same spot, wouldn't that actually address the mental
There is
difference?
some merit in a common language of standards in this respect, so that each party's expectations is using a similar language, if you like, to describe the skills, the expertise, the knowledge, the approach. And Sophia has quite a lot of merit in providing that common framework if it's reasonably broadly adopted. And I think maybe we should start thinking about advocating and even selling Sophia outside the UK with a bit more vigour, because there's no doubt frameworks that provide those sorts of standards that are accepted de facto make life a lot easier when people are planning and organising things, and help match expectations, reduce risk, and all of those good things. So I think there is some merit in that. But I think also the BCS has a role back home, if you like, in working with educators, particularly the business schools, to work on the kind of mindset change that I was talking about. Because a lot of people in this industry go for MBAs, and they don't come out thinking the way I think. And I think the way I think because of 40 years of experience in a global industry. And I'm not that usual, I have to say.
I was going to offer as well, if we're going to have standards that apply globally, and I can see the merit of that you've got consistency, but they need to be independently audited and validated in some way. I've worked with a couple of offshore providers who claim to be CMMI level 5, and I, apart from 3 months in my 25-year career, have never worked in a software company. I've always worked within different sectors using technology. And so, how do you measure up the capabilities of a company? Well, CMMI level 5, most companies I've been in are probably at best level 2, in terms of repeatability and so on. But then you actually get the people who are this highly qualified organisation, and you think, have you brought in a different team from the ones who are audited? Because there's a great variability. And this is the problem, that a company is audited or approved to CMMI, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean all the individuals are.
And I think that in the broader sense is an outsourcing issue, isn't it? You know, where we get a company that has a certain level of capability, and then when they execute, what happens then? And on the sales team, they come in with their best guys, and then when you actually start executing, you get the guys with 6 months experience. I mean, again, it's a management issue, so there's a way of dealing with that to avoid this problem, but you need to be aware that that happens, and that you need to be aware that some companies will do that in order to make their margins, and you have to, you know, manage against that, so you have to prepare. But I think the thing about CMMI, for me, is can you, as a company, as an outsourced company, come into a level 2 company and be effective and you know, bring the right processes so that you work with the existing processes. If the receiving, so that the company who is buying the service has to change all their processes, well, what's the point? You know, that is not ever going to work. It has to be the outsourcing company that adapts to the client, always. So, you know, in that particular context, I think that it's very important that you measure their flexibility in adapting to how are you going to work with us? Demonstrate how you have worked with other clients like us in order to produce a favorable outcome. And then in order to avoid the 6 month guys, you hire the team. Go out there and say, I want these people. You have a named team. It doesn't matter if they're 100, 200. They're names. There are names on the contract, on the schedule. If you don't have the names, they'll swap them out. And you have to have the management in place to be able to identify the people.
But is that something that kind of touches on the thing of trust? If the company has all of its people qualified to a certain level and they're selling their services on that basis, does it matter who the people are on the project? Now, clearly your experience is it absolutely does, and I would support that. And that is therefore evidence of why it isn't sufficient to rely on frameworks and standards. There has to be something else as well.
And you can't do this on a mechanical one-size-fits-all basis because the world is a much more complicated place. So there may be situations where it makes sense to undertake an offshore degree as a contract as a black box. You know, I want that done by that company, and that would be fine. There will be other situations where the scenario that you describe is necessary because you actually have to have a team of resources fully integrated with the work that you're doing. So this is why I go back to what I said earlier. When you're looking at delivering something, the plan that you put together includes the resources and the risk, and you have to go through that systematic process of choice, decision, engagement, so that it works in the particular context. But I see no earthly reason why offshoring shouldn't be a part of that context, and I think some of the work that the BCS can do in developing generally acceptable professional standards and explaining some of these issues to educators certainly can make a significant contribution.